Hello, everyone. This episode was recorded on the 12th of February 2021. So, some of the things that Luke and I say in the episode might be somewhat out of date. You know, as they say, a week in politics is pretty hectic. Nonetheless, I really hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Political Incorrectors podcast. As you know, my name is Eric.
And my name is Luke.
And we are so excited to finally be back with another episode. We've been away for a while, haven't we, Luke?
Yeah, we've taken a bit of a holiday, I suppose, Eric.
Yes, and a lot of people have been getting in touch with us with very kind messages about how they want the podcast to be back, asking questions like, is the Political Incorrectors over? Are you both dead? When will you ever come back? But our absence has partly been because of the fact that we've had a lot of personal responsibilities that we've had to cater to, but also been because of the fact that we've been rethinking and rebranding the podcast and thinking about the direction that we want to go in going forward in the future. And from the deliberations and the planning that we've engaged in, I think we both are confident that this year is going to be a big, better year for the Political Incorrectors podcast.
Absolutely. Look, we put a lot of thought into the podcast, what we want to do with it this year, into the future. And I think everyone, all of our fans who were worried about us and wanted more content, can rest assured now that the Political Incorrectors are back and will be putting out more content on a more regular basis. So I think we're delighted to be back, Eric.
Delighted to be back too.
But to start into it, Eric, there's a lot to go. You know, a lot has happened since our first episode back. God, I don't even remember what month it was, but it was sometime after the general election, which was this month last year, which is kind of actually crazy to think about it. Like, this doll is 1 year old. But obviously, like, in that episode, one of our main points of discussion was the new government that was formed. This big Grand Green Coalition, as we called it, with Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Greens. And a lot has happened since then. So what has been the takeaway, I guess, since then for you? What have you noticed?
Yeah, you're so right, and it's crazy to think that it's been a year now. So much time has passed. I guess in that episode, Luke, we kind of talked about the program for government, and we talked about the dynamics of the new government and how it was a historical new government. For the first time in the history of the state, a government is made up of parties. Sinn Féin, a party performed so well relative to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. So it was a historic shift, electorally speaking, from what has occurred in the past, and we kind of acknowledged that in our episode. But I think something else we talked about was the Green Party, how the Green Party were now entering government for the first time in their history as a party. And we spoke about how radical elements within the Green Party and a lot of radical members were opposed to the fact that the Greens wanted to enter government. And I guess this is something we can kind of get into in a second. But something else that I observed at the time, and something else that I think is kind of apparent from what was stated in the program for government, is the commitment to abolishing direct provision, and how up until now, the white paper that the government promised to commit to in regards to the abolition of direct provision has not been enacted. You know, we don't see it. We're not seeing enough work being done in that area. The program for government was quite green, but I'm not necessarily sure, and I'm not sure if young people are sure of the green developments that the government are making when it comes to climate change and protecting the environment. So those are the three key things that I see. I still think it's a progressive step in the right direction, the fact that the government is so new and historic, but hopefully they get to kind of bring into fruition the changes that the program for government promised.
Yeah, you're so right, and I think the issues you picked out there, like, they're so accurate. I just think back to that episode, and you know, we kind of skipped over the fact of, you know, this was this historic marriage between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the Civil War parties who literally fought each other in war, coming together. And then we skipped over that and didn't really talk about its significance that much. And instead we focused on those radical Greens that we were so doubtful whether they'd get on well in government. But I think our predictions, if we made any predictions at all, were quite accurate. Like, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have got on very well in government. They've kind of they've joined at the hip, and I think that's no surprise to a lot of people because they're so similar ideologically. But you're very right about the Greens. You know, when we had that discussion, we talked about how this was the greenest program for government this country has ever seen, and one of maybe Europe's ever greenest programs for government. But I'm not quite sure we've seen that enacted through policy.
Mm,
But you're also right about those social justice issues that were seen as massive victories for the Greens, direct provision being one of them, which is it's
yeah,
so disappointing to see that that white paper wasn't brought through because we all know how bad direct provision is and how it needs reform. Uh,
yeah,
but as well as that, I think obviously the big elephant in the room is the virus that has plagued the country since
yeah,
then and completely taken up the energy of the government. But
yeah.
I think we could get back to the radical Greens, the people who we kind of celebrated for getting their handprints all over the program for government.
Mm.
What's happened to them since? Well, a lot of them have left the party. They've left the Green Party. What are your thoughts on that before we get like delve straight into it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And it's one that I think has been heavily conversed about by a lot of young people. The fact that the radical kind of members within the Green Party have left the party because of the fact that the party entered government. I think there was a kind of a multitude of different reasons why people left. Apparently, there was complaints about bullying and harassment. And I think those are reasonable grounds to leave any organization, a political one or a non political one. If one is being made to feel uncomfortable within the party, it's understandable to want to leave. But I think there were also ideological reasons for people leaving the party. Many people felt that the Greens entering government was almost a sort of sellout move, which can probably be likened to what many saw as a sellout move from Labour when they entered the government with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil a while ago. So I think there's a lot of kind of comparisons being made between the two, and there's a lot of similar complaints being aimed at the Green Party. But I think it's not as simple as that. The ideological reasons for leaving the government or leaving the Green Party because the Green Party joined government seem to be based on social justice grounds. Because of the fact that the Green Party joining government, it breaches what many believe to be the policy base or the ideological base of the Green Party, or at least the radical beliefs that many people within the Green Party uphold. But I think the major consideration or the key question we need to ask is, in the context of the environment, with climate change approaching us ever so fast, does it make sense to not be in government to enact the political change that you want to see in the context of the environment? It's all good to say, I want to leave because the government, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, don't uphold the same values that I do. But for someone who fervently believes that we need to start taking necessary political action in the context of the environment, is it fair? Is it contradictory to leave the government when you have the chance to make that change when climate change is approaching us so fast? And if your reason is because the next government I want to be a part of will be one with people that uphold all of my ideological beliefs, completely disregarding the art of compromise that's involved in politics. If that's your argument, is it fair when climate change is approaching us so fast? And will it be here by the time the next election comes? Will we start seeing the catastrophic impacts? So I think this is the key question that needs to be considered by many who have left the Green Party on ideological grounds.
You're so right, Eric, and I think you're right to separate the issue. Obviously, there have been very serious, stories about bullying and respect of other people's opinions in the Green Party itself. And I know particularly a lot of women in the party have felt disrespected to a number of degrees and felt that that hasn't been dealt with appropriately. Just off the top of my head, like Lorna Bogue, one of their most prominent councillors in Cork, left the party as well over a similar issue. But you touch on a really good point about ideology and someone's motivations for leaving the party. And I think you're so right. Like, this is the Green Party who've put radical green handprints on the programme for government. They have this chance to be in government for 5 years. We all know that there's a climate and environment crisis where the world is literally at stake, the future of the world and the survival of the next generations. And I do have to wonder, is it productive to leave when you have the chance to push for policy, enact policy, to leave and go to the opposition benches and scream about it and shout about it from the opposition and wait for a day in 5 or 10 years' time when you join a party where somehow everyone around that government table will agree. And to be honest, I do think that is counterproductive, and there's an argument to be made that that's counterproductive because I'm not even sure that in 10 years' time, if, for example, there's a large shift to left wing politics in Ireland, will there still be a government, a left wing government that agrees on every climate policy that the Green Party, for example, will agree
Yeah,
to? And I know there's a lot of issues within some of the more very left wing parties like People Before Profit or Sinn Féin who agree, for example, with a carbon tax, and that's just one example. But I am concerned, to be honest, that maybe the intentions are a little bit blurred here. I think it really begs the question of whether they're better off staying in government to try and
Yeah.
fight for the climate, or are they ideologically opposed to being in government with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and
Yeah.
what's actually at play. And I don't want to criticize them too much or criticize their
Yeah.
intentions, but I think it really does beg the question, and should be highlighted, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important too. I guess another major policy area within the Green Party is social justice. So many of those kind of radical members would have advocated for social justice. So on the grounds of social justice, I actually think one can make a justifiable argument for leaving government. Like for example, if People Before Profit entered the government with Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and members of that party wanted to leave because of policy reasons, completely understandable. I wouldn't expect them to enter the government with the two parties, especially because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are associated with the establishment and they take an anti-establishment approach. So it's understandable on the grounds of social justice. But once you bring it into, shift it into the context of the environment and the environment alone, I think that's when we're treading on very kind of contradictory grounds. That's when people need to be willing to put, in my opinion, as someone who's passionate about fighting climate change, political motivations aside, in the interest of the environment. Maybe it's not as simple as this. Politics is far more complicated than how this dichotomy is making it out to be. But I think in the context of the environment, that's the key question to be asked. Should you withstand and compromise for the sake of the environment, or should you leave and kind of secede from the opportunity to enact political change in the context of the environment because of your own political motivations?
Yeah, you're so right, and I think it does come back to the concept of compromise, and obviously, like, government requires compromise. Not every party who forms the government is going to agree on everything, and I
Mm.
think the problem is in Ireland, obviously, that we're so used to these centre-right governments that are maybe joined by a smaller left-wing party that are kind of
Mm.
pulled to the right, maybe. And I don't think we have the same culture in like other European countries where you have broader coalitions of people
Yeah.
across the ideological spectrum who do have a good kind of culture of compromising and seeing common goals. But I think you kind of pointed to something in your last answer there, Eric, about the establishment, how Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil are the establishment. And obviously at the last election we saw a massive move towards Sinn Féin and a
Yeah.
larger kind of anti-establishment vote. And I think we can tie that in with the Greens leaving government and ask the question, where are those people now going? The people who were on the Green movement in the 2020 general election, who are now, or were at least for some time, politically homeless. We've seen a lot of those in recent times join Labour and the Social Democrats. And for me, the party that does stick out is the Social Democrats, because I don't think anyone expected them to win. I think they got 7 seats in the last election, and that was a massive victory.
Yep.
And we've seen over the last few months the Social Democrats get a large profile
Mm.
and support among young people. And I think that has centred around, in particular, their TD Holly Cairns, who's from Cork, who has been,
Yep.
in fairness, absolutely
Incredible.
amazing. And I think it's very interesting that there's this energy surrounding the Social Democrats.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said, it's something that many people simply did not expect. I think before we get on to the Soc Dems, on Labour, I think it's important to talk about both parties because they seem to be the go-to parties for a lot of people who have left the Green Party as a result of them entering government. I'd like to firstly reference a poll that we put up on Instagram and Twitter. We actually asked people, do you think the radical members of the Green Party were right to leave the Green Party as a result of the Greens entering government? And the majority of people in both polls said that they did think the Green Party were right in doing so. Some people said no, but most of the people said yes. So I think that's quite interesting because this was voted upon by young people. So it's interesting to see how young people think in regards to that issue. But in terms of the Soc Dems, as you said, I think they've just really been playing their cards right. Especially, we can't talk about the Soc Dems' rise in popularity without talking about Holly Cairns. I honestly think, Luke, she has really been incredibly effective as a politician within the modern time. She really gives me like 2005, 2006 Obama vibes. Like prior to Obama's ascendancy within the Democratic Party, people, as a senator, people were talking about how exciting he was, how he was pushing the right buttons, he was playing his cards right. I really think Holly Cairns is doing that. Any kind of major youth issue that young people talk about and care about, she's on it straight away, just like that on Instagram live videos. Instagram, a platform that many young people are active on, giving them something to share and talk about. So I think she's been really effective in the Social Democrats' rise in popularity. But young people engaging with that party, I actually think they have garnered more engagement. This is anecdotal, not based on data, than Labour, because of the fact that Labour's reputation has been somewhat tarred, again, because of their association with the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil government a few years ago. Because the Soc Dems they really have a clean slate. Nothing really people can hold them to. I think this is why a lot of young people have been able to find a home within the party, like following the dissolution of the Green Party or the radical elements of the Green Party. So I think they've been really effective to garner and give a home to those who didn't feel they could find one in the now governmental Green Party. So yeah.
Yeah, you're so right, and I think if there's any chance that Holly Cairns does listen to this podcast, she'll be delighted to hear to be compared to Barack Obama. So that's she'll be delighted to hear that one. But you're so right. I think you touched on a really good point there about the difference between Social Democrats and Labour, and maybe the reputation that Labour had from being in government with Fine Gael. But also, I think you know, under the leadership of Brendan Howlin, maybe people weren't as excited about the Labour Party, for in the last Dáil. And I think what came with the Social Democrats was obviously Holly Cairns has been amazing. We've mentioned that, and it does have to be pointed out. But as well as that, their other TDs have been very effective. Like Gary Gannon has been a very good spokesperson for education, for example. Cian O'Callaghan, another TD, Jennifer Whitmore. All of their TDs are very impressive people. And as you said, a lot of young Irish people in particular have found a political home in the Social Democrats, and there's a big movement building across the country, which is what a good political party needs, communities on the ground. But I do wonder, are they going to be a viable party into the future? And at the next election, will the momentum be there to bring them over the line and win seats? And will Sinn Féin's rise in popularity be a risk to their seats? Especially the last seat, for example, in a lot of constituencies, could a second Sinn Féin candidate knock them out? It's very interesting. But I think we also asked our brilliant followers about the Social Democrats. Do you remember what they said in the poll?
Yes, I think you kind of touched on how it like the key question is this kind of a temporary rise in popularity that is going to dwindle over time for the Soc Dems, or will it be a sustaining rise? And it's a really tricky one to answer, and that was reflected in the two polls he put out on social media. So on Instagram, the majority of people thought that the Soc Dems' rise would last, whereas on Twitter, the majority of people thought that it wouldn't. So it's quite a conflicted one, and it's very hard to guess how it's going to go for the parties. But I would like to kind of address the point in regards to Sinn Féin and their rise in popularity, and how that might stunt the rise in popularity for the Soc Dems. I think it's widely known at this point that if Sinn Féin, because of how well they did, ran more candidates, they could have been the majority party in the Dáil. They could have had the most seats in the Dáil relative to other parties. And if they did, a lot of the Soc Dem seats that were won would not have been won, because they would have been won by Sinn Féin candidates. So it's important to mention that. However, I think that applies to this time last year during the election. I think the dynamics of Irish politics have changed significantly in recent times, and the Soc Dems now are not the party that they were then. So if there's an election today, that might be slightly different. It might not be, but it might be slightly different, especially because a lot of people saw last year's vote as a protest vote against the establishment. Maybe the dynamics have changed to the point where people are looking for something fresh and something new, which is something that a lot of people feel the Soc Dems provide. However, we can't discard the fact that Sinn Féin are doing incredibly well to win over the youth vote and engage with young people, especially when it comes to youth issues like the Leaving Cert. So it's interesting to see where this is going to bring Sinn Féin and the other parties in the context of the next general election.
Definitely. They're great points. And look, the Sinn Féin rise in popularity took everyone by surprise, I think. But it marks a very important point in Irish politics where we've moved away from the two-party system, obviously, of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil fighting each other, even though they're very similar. But now we have this really big movement in Sinn Féin of not just left-wing politics, but anti-establishment politics as well. And I think they're winning over a lot more voters than left-wing voters. They're winning people who just don't like the government, people who might say that, politicians, they're only in it for the money, that type of voter, someone who maybe isn't as ideological, or who doesn't believe, like, for example, identify themselves as a socialist, but people across age spectrums voting for something different. And I think that's what we saw with Sinn Féin. It was a vote for change, as they said themselves. And I think that's what they represent. And to be honest, I think their victory at the polls represents what I believe is not a vote for left wing politics, but a vote for change and a
Yeah.
vote from a step away from the establishment. But that does lead us on quite nicely into, looking ahead past this Dáil, as interesting and exciting as it is. What is the future of Irish politics, and where
Mm.
do, for example, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil go from here?
Yeah, it's a very hard one to predict, but I think the last general election really sets down a very positive precedent for us all to draw from when it comes to predicting how we're going to go. And I think it does provide a lot of hope. I think it signifies the fact that our electorate is now on its toes. For so long, it was just Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. They were the go-to default parties. But now people are willing to be politically attentive and vote for what they believe to be is best for them. I actually think it's very easy to have multilateral, bipartisan support for the fact that the electorate voted for something else to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Probably unless they're in Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, because of the fact that, not because they voted for Sinn Féin, but because they voted for something new and something different. And it could have been Fine Gael they voted for if they hadn't been in government for so long, or the Greens or the Soc Dems. But the fact that it was different gives me a lot of hope for the future, and shows that the electorate is going to be active and going to be voting for what they believe to be in their best interest, and not voting along traditional lines, which is quite apparent within electoral activity in Irish politics. But the future, I think the Soc Dems, the thing about Sinn Féin, I think that it's very important to consider, is that they are politically adamant about a united Ireland. I actually remember after the election, I think I saw a post as Sinn Féin rep, it might have been Mary Lou, put up about her being in talks about a united Ireland. This is before we actually formed the government, and when many people were sure that Sinn Féin would be a part of the government, she was like immediately hell-bent on committing to the cause for a united Ireland right after the election. So I think it's a political motivation. I think united Ireland for most people in Ireland is nostalgia, but for Sinn Féin, it's a fervent, adamant goal. And I think, as you said, their voter base is a broad church. People are there because of ideology. They're kind of corrupt government, finger-pointing types who have genuine concerns about some of the ills that they face because of the government, and the anti-establishment type vote for Sinn Féin as well. But I think as time passes on, when things boil down and the United Ireland message kind of comes to the forefront, I think it's going to lead a lot of people who are part of the Sinn Féin voter base to question whether it's really the voter base they want to be a part of, because their commitment to United Ireland is immediate, and it's something that not a lot of their voters might subscribe to. And because they have such a broad church and they have to appeal to so many people, I think decisions will have to be made within the Sinn Féin base, whether it's a base for them, based on the fact that there's a plethora of different policies and values that Sinn Féin uphold. I hope you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, you definitely. That's a really interesting point, and I've actually thought about it myself as well. I think, like, at the election, Sinn Féin did position themselves as this party of change, as the anti-establishment party, and they talked about issues like housing, like healthcare, and like the big issue at the time was the pension age. They put these issues at the forefront of their manifestos and their public appearance, but core to their values as politicians and as a party and as a movement is United Ireland, obviously. It's their kind of reason for existence, like historically, obviously.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting is that that didn't go away after this election. It was
Yeah.
exactly what they were talking about as soon as they were elected. And the fact that they were talking about a United Ireland already, even before they were even entered government talks or tried to form a government. And I know, like, not so long ago, they put forward a position paper on an all Ireland economy, for example.
Yeah.
This is still very much part of their being. And it's actually very interesting to think about if they keep being vocal about this and it being a very important issue for them, as it should be because it's why they exist as a party.
Yeah.
Will support shed for them, and will people look maybe to the Soc Dems, for example, or to Labour, or maybe even to the further left like PBP or the Solidarity Party, for example?
Yeah.
That's a very, very interesting point, definitely.
And something in addition that beyond Sinn Féin, I think we definitely need to talk about Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and their place in the future of Irish politics. I'll refer to the polls that we actually put up before we can share our opinions on their place. So on Instagram, the majority of people felt that Fine Gael won't have a place in the future of Irish politics, but it was very slim. I believe it was 55-45. But with Fianna Fáil, the overwhelming majority of people felt that Fianna Fáil will not have a place in the future of Irish politics. So I think both parties apparently won't, according to those who voted in the polls on both Twitter and Instagram. But Fine Gael have more of a chance to secure a place within the future than Fianna Fáil do. And I personally speaking, I think it's somewhat accurate. We spoke about in our last episode with Uremu, a councillor from Longford, who's part of the Fianna Fáil party, whether Fianna Fáil will be able to secure a place in the future, especially considering the fact that young people see them as a particular way and associate them with particular things. Do they have a strong voter base that is based upon young people? How are they attracting young people? If you're young people, what do you want to join Fianna Fáil for? I think these are the key questions that need to be asked. Considering how young people see Fianna Fáil, it's hard to know whether they will have a base. I think it's important to consider the fact that in the early 2000s, Fine Gael were in a very similar position where no one could really see where they were going to go. No one really knew if they were going to have a future in Irish politics. Then they were able to turn things around because they attracted political Spartans and charismatic figureheads who were able to flip turn things for the party and help them ascend, electorally speaking. I think Fianna Fáil need that right now, especially when it comes to the future. Fine Gael, it's hard to know as well what the story is. I think they do offer a kind of pragmatic type of politics. I don't know if using that word is somewhat cliche, but they do. they offer a kind of politics that people see as pragmatic and the status quo. And I think that appeals to a lot of people. And maybe some young people will feed into it. But I think right now, amongst a lot of youth, the consensus is common sense, left-wing politics. And if this is the way that we go, it's going to be interesting to see how this shifts the game of cards in Irish politics going forward.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting, and I think Fianna Fáil is a very interesting point, for example. But I might start with Fine Gael. I think I would disagree. I do think, like, obviously a lot of people who answered their polls said they won't have a place in the future of Irish politics because of young people's perceptions of the party. I do disagree with that. I do think they have a place in the future of Irish politics. They perform very well in polls still while Fianna Fáil kind of dwindle. But also, if you look at youth support, they're not doing absolutely terribly with, like, for example, the 18 to 24 age gap. They're not doing, like, absolutely dismally, but obviously they're doing very bad in comparison to Sinn Féin. And for me, I think it's just going to be about how they position themselves as a party going forward. Do they kind of move away from the kind of center ground they've established themselves on, not doing anything overly exciting or big or structural change in society, but more so the kind of common sense economic policies and politics? Do they move to the right to try and win over people on the right, or do they try and become sort of more progressive? And you see people like Simon Harris, for example, or Helen McEntee, who kind of put themselves forward as more progressive voices in Irish politics. And do we see that come to the fore in Fine Gael more? But is that enough to win over youth support from policies and politicians like Sinn Féin, or like the Soc Dems, or like People Before Profit? And maybe would that change if there is a left-wing government led by Sinn Féin, for example, and maybe it isn't as perfect as people might make out? So I think watching Fine Gael will be very interesting in the future. On Fianna Fáil, that's going to be very interesting. They're in a very precarious position. And I think, to be honest, I can't see them ever being dominant in Irish politics again. I don't see them leading a government again after this Dáil. Now, I could be completely wrong, but this is my feeling. And I think we've seen, especially in the last few weeks, their TDs and parliamentary party have softened up to the idea of a coalition with Sinn Féin. And so I think a possibility is that Fianna Fáil become a kind of smaller party with Sinn Féin in government, perhaps, and bit by bit move to the left and take on a more nationalist kind of Republican ethos and become that type of party. But who knows? It could all change at the next Dáil. But it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And I think two brief points to kind of follow up on what you said. I absolutely agree. Firstly, I think there's a tendency for young people who are politically engaged, like you and I, to kind of go on Twitter and see the opinions that a lot of people are sharing. Man, if you went on Twitter for a day and you saw a lot of the things that people were putting out there based on politics, you would probably predict that the government will look a particular way in 10 years, which might be completely out of touch with what it's actually going to be like, because a lot of the people on the ground who don't care for ideology, who do not care about having a one-wing government or another wing government, but simply care about a government that's going to tackle the issues that they have to face on a regular basis. They might want a different government, and that is what makes up the electorate. So while it's easy to kind of say young people want a particular thing based on what we see online and based on what we hear from the politically active, it's so important to understand that the nature of politics in Ireland has very much been a reaction to the issues that are at hand, and not necessarily driven by ideology. I think a lot of the people that voted for change in the last election didn't vote for, as you said earlier, a government that is formed in a particular ideological way, but instead a government that's going to respond to the big issues that plague our nation, like health, like homelessness. So, and also, I think the young people are flexible. I think right now, generally, we might think a particular thing, but in the future, I think we're always going to vote based on issues, and we might think something else. So I don't think it's fair to kind of look at the current climate and predict that something's going to look a particular way in the future in terms of the electoral makeup of our parliament. But it's very interesting to see where we do go. And Fine Gael, I think, as you said, there is a broad church. There are people who espouse a more progressive message like Helen McEntee and a lot of other members within the party. And it contains maybe more conservative-leaning people. Whereas with Fianna Fáil, I think it's conflicted in terms of its values. So whereas Fine Gael might mold itself and position itself as a party that appeals to young people, I don't know if that's possible within Fianna Fáil, because I don't know what Fianna Fáil is based on as a young person. It's hard to know. They're the Republican Party, a party for a united Ireland, but at the same time, it's easy to interpret them as an establishment party, which completely conflicts with the concept of them being a Republican nationalist workers' party. So it's going to be interesting to see what position they uptake rigidly to go forward. But I think these are defining times for the Fianna Fáil party, and they need to kind of move wisely, or else, as you said, it might lead to the extinction of the party going forward. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out.
Definitely. Well, Eric, there are definitely interesting times ahead, and no doubt with the political incorrectors back in business, we will be chronicling all of the events in Irish politics and looking at these changes and trying to make predictions and discuss it from a young person's point of view, or as we set out to do this podcast, to at least make it more accessible for young people. But I think that is all we have time for today, Eric. So the future of Irish politics looks extremely interesting, but Eric, we, the political incorrectors, will be here to follow it all and analyse it and make it accessible for young people. But for now, I think that brings this episode to a natural end.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you engage with us going forward within 2021. We have no doubt in our minds that 2021 is going to be a bigger and better year for the Political Incorrectors podcast. So we can't wait to get delivering the content that you want to see for you.
Absolutely. But for now, be sure to follow us on social media at political_incorrectors on most platforms. Let us know what you think about the podcast, some ideas for future episodes, maybe even some ideas for guests. But most importantly, keep an eye out for future episodes, and we will talk to you then. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.